For more than 2 decades, Al Roker has stood beneath storm-darkened skies and blazing summer suns, delivering forecasts with a steady smile that has comforted generations. But there are seasons no satellite image can predict, and in the quiet hours before dawn, when the studio lights of today have not yet warmed the set, he has sometimes found himself thinking about men like Richard Engel, reporters who walk toward gunfire while the rest of the world changes the channel. And he wonders about the cost of telling hard truths to an audience that often seems too tired, too distracted, or too overwhelmed to fully absorb them. Al has spent his career translating atmospheric chaos into language families can understand over their morning coffee, but covering hurricanes that swallow coastlines and wildfires that reduce lifelong homes to ash has given him glimpses into the same emotional terrain that foreign correspondents traverse in war zones, a terrain where resilience and sorrow share the same crammed quarters of the heart. As he has grown older, now in a season of life that many of his viewers share, he has come to recognize that the real storm is not always the one swirling on the radar, but the one that lingers quietly inside a storyteller who must describe devastation with clarity, yet keep his own despair carefully folded away. And in conversations at home with his wife, Deborah Roberts, whose own reporting has taken her into communities fractured by injustice and loss, they sometimes speak in low voices about the peculiar burden journalists carry, the obligation to witness suffering again and again, to translate it faithfully, and then to move on to the next assignment while the images remain imprinted on their private thoughts. Deborah understands in a way few others can, because she too has stood in neighborhoods where sirens replace lullabies, and together they have learned that bearing witness is both a privilege and a weight, especially in an era when outrage flares brightly and fades quickly, leaving reporters to grapple with the uneasy sense that the stories that once shook them to their core barely ripple the surface of public attention. For viewers in their 60s who have watched the world transform from the reassuring cadence of evening network broadcasts to the relentless churn of 24-hour updates, Al's reflections feel personal because they remember when names and places lingered in the national consciousness for weeks, even months, and they sense, as he does, that something in the collective spirit has grown fatigued. He has read accounts of Richard Engel returning from conflict zones, carrying not only notebooks filled with facts, but also the invisible residue of trauma, the echo of explosions, the memory of frightened children, the moral injury of observing cruelty without the power to stop it. And Al recognizes a quieter version of that residue after standing in flooded towns where elderly couples clutch damp photo albums and ask whether the waters will rise again next year. What binds a war correspondent and a weatherman is not the scale of danger, but the repetition of human vulnerability, the steady exposure to moments when ordinary lives fracture under extraordinary pressure. As birthdays accumulate and friends begin to speak more often of doctor's visits and retirement plans, Al has grown more reflective about what endurance truly means, understanding that strength is not the absence of feeling, but the willingness to keep showing up, to keep speaking plainly about what is happening, even when the audience seems numb. Deborah often reminds him that indifference is rarely absolute, that beneath the noise, people still care deeply, even if they struggle to process the magnitude of suffering delivered to their screens each day. And in those conversations, they return to a shared conviction that journalism, at its best, is an act of compassion, a bridge between distant pain and domestic comfort. Yet compassion, they both know, extracts a price. And for reporters like Richard Engel, the psychological toll can be profound, manifesting not only in sleepless nights, but in the subtle reshaping of how one sees the world, where crowds are scanned instinctively for threats, and joy is tempered by the awareness of how quickly stability can dissolve. Al has felt a gentler version of that vigilance during hurricane season, when every shift in wind direction carries the potential for tragedy. and he has learned to balance professional composure with private rituals of restoration, long walks, quiet laughter with Deborah, moments of gratitude for ordinary mornings unmarred by sirens. To an audience in their early retirement years, these reflections resonate because they too have navigated decades of headlines, assassinations, wars, economic upheavals, and have felt the cumulative weight of witnessing history's harsher chapters. They understand that documenting conflict for what can feel like an indifferent world requires not only courage, but also a reservoir of hope, stubborn enough to believe that truth-telling still matters. In the end, Al does not compare his career to Richard Engels in terms of peril, but he recognizes a shared calling to look steadily at events others might prefer to ignore and to translate them into stories that honor the dignity of those affected. And as he stands once more before the cameras, adjusting his tie while studio monitors flicker with images of another approaching storm somewhere in the world, he carries with him a deeper awareness that every report, whether from a battlefield or a battered coastline, is a reminder of our fragile interconnectedness, and that even in an age that sometimes appears indifferent, the simple act of bearing witness, of refusing to look away, remains a quiet, enduring form of care.